What if Ukraine joined NATO in 2013? Imagine a world where Ukraine became a NATO member in 2013. How would our current global landscape look today? Would Europe and the world be more stable, or would the tensions with Russia have escalated further into chaos? In this video, we'll explore the economic and geopolitical implications this decision could have had from three core perspectives: Ukraine, NATO, and Russia. By the end of this video, you'll have a clearer understanding of how choices in geopolitics ripple across nations and decades. But most importantly, we want to hear your thoughts. Let's dive into this captivating alternate reality. Let's start by revisiting 2013. Ukraine was at a crossroads. Its leadership and people were torn between closer alignment with the European Union, symbolized by the association agreement, and maintaining ties with Russia, a powerful neighbor deeply intertwined in its history, economy, and energy structures. NATO, for its part, had clear strategic goals at the time. As a military alliance, it sought to ensure the security of its member states, bolster collective defense systems, and maintain stability in Europe. However, NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe had already alarmed Russia, which regarded it as an encroachment into its sphere of influence. Meanwhile, Russia, led by Vladimir Putin, was harboring deep resentment toward the West's increasing foothold near its borders. Following the Cold War, Russia saw NATO enlargement as a betrayal of unspoken promises to limit its eastward expansion. For the Kremlin, a Ukraine-NATO partnership would have been seen as nothing less than a fundamental threat. This is the backdrop of our scenario: a deeply divided Ukraine, a NATO hesitant to provoke Russia, and a Kremlin determined to maintain control over what it views as a buffer zone. Now let's imagine what could have unfolded if Ukraine had been invited into NATO in 2013. For Ukraine, NATO membership could have been a transformational milestone in its modern history. By joining the alliance, Ukraine would have obtained the security guarantees of Article 5, which stipulates that an attack against one NATO member is an attack against all. This might have completely altered the trajectory of events that followed, particularly Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. With NATO backing, would Russia have even considered annexing Crimea? The military consequences of breaching NATO's collective security could have been too great for the Kremlin to risk. Hypothetically, NATO forces stationed in Ukraine might have acted as a deterrent against any form of aggression, securing Ukraine's territorial integrity and sparing it from years of conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk. Economically, NATO membership might have opened the floodgates for foreign investment. Access to Western markets, better protection for investors, and reduced risks of conflict would likely have created a more stable business environment. Ukraine's economy, which has struggled due to corruption and ongoing conflict, might have seen accelerated development by aligning firmly with the West. However, it's not all rosy. NATO membership comes with obligations, financial commitments, defense spending targets, and compromises on foreign policy. Would Ukraine's fragile political system in 2013 have withstood these pressures? And more critically, how would the divided Ukrainian populace, particularly in the pro-Russian eastern regions, have reacted? Could NATO membership have deepened internal divisions rather than healing them? From NATO's perspective, bringing Ukraine into the fold would have been both a strategic opportunity and a monumental risk. On one hand, Ukraine occupies a geographically critical position. Its proximity to Russia and access to the Black Sea make it a key piece in the chessboard of European security. Adding Ukraine would have strengthened NATO's defense posture in Eastern Europe and expanded its influence to a country with significant regional importance. But the risks cannot be overstated. First, NATO's acceptance of Ukraine would have been viewed by Russia as a direct threat. Unlike countries such as Poland or the Baltic states, Ukraine shares a long, deeply interconnected history with Russia. Its inclusion in NATO would have crossed a red line for the Kremlin, potentially triggering an even stronger response than what was seen in 2014. NATO's logistical considerations also deserve attention. Would the alliance have been prepared to defend Ukraine in the event of Russian aggression? Eastern Ukraine's proximity to the Russian border would have made it highly vulnerable to Moscow's conventional and hybrid warfare tactics. Furthermore, was NATO politically prepared to engage in a conflict with Russia, given the internal divisions within its members, over how far the alliance should go in provoking Moscow? Another question worth asking is this: would uniting Ukraine with NATO have brought stability across the region? Or might it have exacerbated the East-West divide, amplifying Cold War-era hostilities in a modern context? For Vladimir Putin's Kremlin, NATO's expansion into Ukraine would have been the ultimate provocation. Ukraine, in the Russian worldview, is not merely a neighboring state. It holds immense cultural, historical, and strategic significance. Losing Ukraine to NATO would have been perceived as losing the last major buffer between Russia and the West. This raises an intriguing question. If Ukraine had joined NATO in 2013, would Russia have acted more aggressively? The annexation of Crimea might have happened earlier, potentially on a larger scale. Russia could have also opted for direct military confrontation, despite the risks of clashing with NATO forces. Putin's rhetoric often emphasizes that Russia cannot tolerate NATO troops on its doorstep. But there's another side to consider. NATO's collective defense mechanisms might have also acted as a deterrent. If Ukraine's NATO membership signaled an inevitable and overwhelming military response to any incursions, Moscow may have reconsidered its moves altogether. Could NATO membership for Ukraine have restrained Russian ambitions? Economically, Moscow would have faced significant costs. Sanctions from the West already took a toll on Russia's economy after its actions in 2014. A more aggressive response to Ukraine's NATO membership could have deepened its isolation. Yet, this might have also driven Russia further into alliances with other global powers like China, restructuring the balance of power on a global scale. Let's zoom out from the individual actors and consider the larger ripple effects. First, Europe's energy security would likely have been a major flashpoint. Ukraine serves as a critical transit route for Russian natural gas to Europe. Under NATO, would Ukraine have had greater leverage to renegotiate terms with Russia? Or might Moscow have found alternative routes, fast-tracking projects like Nord Stream 2 to bypass Ukraine entirely? Then there's the question of global markets. Would Ukraine's NATO membership have reassured Western investors, boosting its economy and creating opportunities for regional development? Or would the heightened tensions with Russia have caused global markets to react negatively, sending ripples through Europe? Another consideration is the realignment of global alliances. NATO's presence in Ukraine might have galvanized efforts by Russia, China, and other powers to counter what they perceive as Western dominance. Would we have seen a Eurasian bloc rise sooner, reshaping the geopolitical landscape? Ultimately, the core question is, would Ukraine's NATO membership in 2013 have brought greater stability or triggered greater conflict? On one hand, NATO's extension of collective security could have deterred Russian aggression, solidifying Ukraine's independence and fostering stability in Europe. On the other hand, it's also possible that this bold move would have ignited a larger confrontation with devastating consequences far beyond Eastern Europe. This alternate reality exposes just how many interconnected variables exist in geopolitics. A single decision, such as Ukraine joining NATO, has the potential to reshape alliances, spark conflicts, and redefine economic systems globally. It's also worth considering how public perception might have shaped these dynamics. Within Ukraine, NATO membership may have been celebrated in the Western regions, but provoked resentment in the East. Could this have further divided the country, or might it have created a unifying sense of purpose in standing against external threats? Globally, how would NATO's decision to admit Ukraine have been received? Its critics might have labeled it reckless provocation, while its supporters could have seen it as a decisive stand for democracy and Western values. Examining this scenario reveals just how precarious the balance of power is in geopolitics. Decisions like whether to include a country like Ukraine in NATO affect not just the countries involved, but the entire international system. The past decade has shown us the consequences of this balancing act and its fragile, unpredictable nature. But what about you? What do you think the world would look like today if Ukraine had joined NATO in 2013? Would we be living in a more stable, secure Europe? Or would this decision have brought the world even closer to a dangerous escalation? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this exploration of what-if scenarios in geopolitics, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more thought-provoking content. Your engagement helps us bring you more analyses on the complexities of our world.